This is the second studio by the Architecture and Design Office fame. My name is David Lee, and with me is Marina Borderonay. The two of us are partners at the office and, of course, hosts of the show. And today our guest is Walter Hood.
Walter is the creative director and founder of Hood Design Studio, a social art and design practice based in Oakland, California.
And Walter shares with us his life story and how he ended up studying landscape architecture, and art, and how he weaves all those together in his practice and his research, his teaching, his everything. And I think this conversation is in some ways an interesting way to understand his very fascinating and eclectic and different type of career. At the same time, understand each of these different disciplines and what they contribute to each other in their thinking. There's a lot of like design, philosophical design conversation in the recording and what he has to say, and also more practical things, careers and project. I don't know. We just covered everything is what I feel like.
It's very enjoyable.
Yeah. Sponsors.
Would you like to get Asbirds faster?
Yes.
Okay. IPX has you covered. IPX lets you seamlessly transform laser scans into LOD 300 BIM and CAD files. Whether you've got your 3D scans already or need the full laser scanning service, IPX offers instant pricing and order tracking for scan-to-BIM services on any project, no matter the size or complexity. Once a building scan is complete, IPX delivers detailed BIM, CAD, 360 virtual tours, and material takeoffs in their platform, where you can view, share, export, query, and quantify areas, floors, and materials. Check out the IPX link in our show notes.
Designers and architects, if you're looking for a powerful, real-time visualization and VR tool, then check out Enscape. Enscape is super easy to use because it's a plugin and not a standalone application, which means you can directly work in your SketchUp, ArchiCAD, Rhino, Vectorworks, or Revit model. In fact, it only takes a couple of clicks from installation to creating your first rendering. Enscape does realistic renderings, 360-degree panoramas and videos, and virtual reality environments. We use Enscape in our office, we love it, and we think you will too. So click the Enscape 3D link in our show notes to learn more. Revit users, you have access to a powerful new capability you might not know about. Available with Revit version 2023.1 onward, Autodesk Insight is a next-generation carbon analysis tool that can help you make the leap toward low-carbon design. With only a few clicks, Insight lets you analyze, understand, and track the embodied and operational carbon impact of your design choices. You can then visualize opportunities for energy efficiency and carbon mitigation with its flexible dashboards, helping you make more sustainable and informed decisions. Check out the Insight link in our show notes to learn more. This is the second studio with myself, Marina, and our guest, Walter Hood. Here we go. Wow, what a cool studio. That's your office?
No, this is my house studio. I can give you a kind of...
Oh, gosh, that's even cooler.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
It's no bakery that I'm in the midst of still trying to, rehab. But my painting studio is up top back there somewhere. So, yeah.
Wow.
This is my escape.
We'll probably keep this part... Yeah, we'll probably keep this part in the interview. That's really interesting. So, actually, just starting with that, because I'm curious about your space. So this is your house. This is where you live and work.
This is where I live and kind of escape to on the weekends. I have a painting studio, and I have about 5,000 square feet of space, which is an old bakery that I'm rehabbing, and it's just nice, coming to a space where I don't have the office or school mess dealing with me. So
yeah,
is that space also in Oakland, like your office?
Yeah, this space is between Berkeley and my office, so each one is kind of perfect. My office is 1 mile one way and Berkeley is 1 mile the other way, so I'm kind of right in between.
Perfect.
You're making a lot of people listening jealous. That's like an ideal to be right between a mile from academia, a mile from practice. Like it's
and a mile from the bay. And a mile from the bay. So I'm like, it's a very nice triangle here.
That's beautiful. I think that's kind of the dream of a lot of, landscape architects, designers, creatives, is to have a house kind of retreat space like you're describing that also has enough square footage to still make and do stuff.
Yeah.
That's phenomenal. How long have you had the space for?
I purchased it right at the lowest on the market. So I guess that was 2018 when the market crashed. Was that 2018 or 2008? I forget now. I want to say
2008 was the big dip.
I think I bought in 2008. I didn't move in until 2012 or 13. Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
Wow.
Was it a huge change? I was going to say relief. Like, was it a big shift once you had it? Because now you had a space to occupy fully if you didn't have it before?
Yeah, because my office started over in West Oakland and in a 2,000 square foot, stacked loft in an old sign factory. And I started the studio there. And I had it downstairs, and it was slowly growing upstairs. And I literally was left in the mezzanine in my little Corbu. I had a little Corbu sail up there, where I had a bathroom, I had a washer, dryer, and a bed. And while I was rehabbing this space, I was able to, I stayed there, but it gave me this kind of goal to get this place ready so I could move into it. So,
yeah, that's phenomenal. That's really cool. Well, I guess going sort of backward in time, as I was saying, one of the first questions we always like to ask folks is, where did they grow up? What it was like growing up there, and any particular memories associated with architecture or landscape architecture, looking back on your childhood?
I don't know. I think I had a kind of a normal childhood. I grew up as my father was a lifetime military. So, we grew up moving around when I was very small. We lived in Fort Bragg, North Carolina. We moved to Fontainebleau, France. We moved back to North Carolina. Then my dad kind of was stationed in different places. And my mother decided to make Charlotte the hometown while my dad still served in the service. So my memories are, of growing up in an all Black neighborhood in inner city Charlotte. And I wouldn't say there was an interest in, architecture or landscape architecture until I got to high school. In high school, I discovered drafting, and that was the alternative to, like shop. And there were like these guys in cloaks. And by this time, Charlotte was integrated. And so they were all white guys in this inner city school where they were bussed in, but all the white kids were taking drafting and all the Black kids were taking shop or auto mechanics. And I was like, what is this thing you guys are doing? It's like drafting. I was like, can I take? It's like, sure. And so I ended up falling in love with drafting and drawing. And then my teacher turned me on to architectural programs that I then applied to in college, and ended up going to North Carolina A&T, which is an HBCU where he had gone to. And they had architecture engineering at the time. And I didn't see the engineering part. I just saw architecture. So I enrolled in architecture engineering. And the first year I was like, there were drawing courses, but it was not a lot of design. And then in that second year, I think it was in the second year, they started a landscape architecture program. And I remember going to a presentation. And I don't know if it was Paul Friedberg or someone like that, but I just saw all these beautiful drawings the way they were drawing. And I changed majors and then became the first graduate of the first landscape architecture program at HBCU, which was started by Dr. Charles Fountain. And so that was kind of the beginnings. And I should have known something was up, being the first right from this program, and then going into a profession that, is predominantly, white, very few minorities. And I saw myself just kind of experiencing different things till I got to a place where I was like, I need to change careers. And that's when I applied to Berkeley into architecture and landscape architecture. And I went back to architecture, and I ended up at Berkeley getting degrees in urbanism, architecture, and landscape architecture.
It's a lot of degrees.
Yeah.
Going back, you were saying that when you were growing up, and your mom decided that it was Charlotte, right?
Yeah.
Charlotte, North Carolina was going to be the place. Was that, I'm not familiar, was the city fairly recently integrated when you were in school, or was that something from a more distant past?
No.
I'm also wondering, like, you being in the drafting courses, it sounds like possibly the only Black student in there. It was probably quite an experience.
Yeah, but it was during integration. Integration in Charlotte lasted between, I want to say 1970 all the way up until the 80s. So they went through a decade of trying to figure out, do we bring whites into the city? I think the first year we were bussed out of the city. And it just went back and forth. And it was, during that time, the tumultuous time where Boston was having these big issues. There's that famous, image of the guy stabbing someone with a flag. That's in the mid 70s, I want to say, or late 70s. And so we were going back and forth, back and forth. And so by the time I got to high school, we were well into integration, but we hadn't figured out. And so during my high school time, whites were bussed into the city. And then once I graduated, by the 80s rolled around, they had literally figured it out, and then vouchers started coming in, right? And so kids who could get a voucher either went to a private school, and then that's where you saw kind of the decay of the public schools, like in the 80s.
I see. I also am very, very curious. What was it like to go from Charlotte, North Carolina to Fontainebleau, France?
I mean, I was a kid. I was like 4, 5, 6. So, I mean, it was, as my sisters think, for me, it was all fantasy. I mean, I remember the forest. I remember the Black Forest, going to the Black Forest. I remember there were carnivals, or how can I say, carnivals on, like, there were Ferris merry-go-rounds, right? There would be a market and a merry-go-round. I was adopted by a young French guy who made bikes or liked biking. He ended up giving me a bike, and I took the bike back to the US. I remember having the bike for like so long in the backyard, and it had my name written on it. I remember, French bread. So cool. I mean, it was one of those
That's
things.
That's why you live in a bakery now.
I know, right? But it's just one of those things where, it's just in my memory. And of course, I probably romanticized it because, my dad was in the military, and he was part of the med evac. And so he drove an ambulance, actually, which was kind of cool. So when you think of MASH, my dad had one of those things that he drove around during the day. So
interesting. I studied abroad to Fontainebleau, France when I was in architecture school, so I know the place. Yeah, and because you might know, but they have the École des Beaux-Arts, the Font. I don't speak French, so I'm butchering all this stuff.
École des Beaux-Arts,
and historically it was. Yeah. Historically, the program was a mixture of art. Actually, in thinking about it, it kind of ties to you because previously it was art, architecture, and music, and I think now it's just landscape architecture and music.
I didn't know that.
Something.
I have to look into that now.
Yeah. It's you're kind of almost an ideal. They would love to have you, I'm sure, as like a guest critic or something because your background is, and you've been there, so I'm sure you're in high demand to be a guest critic at every university.
Actually, I had a friend from Italy who was over there actually this summer doing some teaching, and she texted me and showed me an image, which was funny.
That's cool. So you end up in an AE, architectural engineering, which is, as you said, not the same thing as architecture. And you switched to landscape. And so was it truly that presentation and seeing I'm assuming hand renderings, hand drawings of a landscape architect that drew you toward that profession, that study?
Yeah, it was just more, it was more creative thinking versus what I was beginning to learn in architecture engineering, which was, much more mechanical, right? Everything was mechanical. But it was also, at that time, I didn't know that, I've always had an interest in art, and just to kind of see, colorful drawings, I was like, that's interesting. And then having to learn plants and all of these things, I'm like, this is not what those images look like, because we had to learn like 1,000 plants, and, it was a program in plant science. And so botany was a big part of it as well. But, it was a great education. And, going to an HBCU at the time, I didn't know this was a state school. And in a way, it's literally built upon the tenets of Booker T. Washington, where, it was really about skill building, right? And giving students these tools to go out into the world. And so the liberal arts part of that was something that I didn't know I lacked until, again, I went out into the world, and I worked in Washington, D.C. for the Park Service for about 1.5 years. Then I moved to Philadelphia and worked for a firm for like 4 years or so. Then I worked for an architecture firm for another year. And it was during that time I started meeting different people, going to New York and places. And and really seeing that there was another aspect to the work that we were doing, which had less to do with the skill set per se, but it had more to do with the thinking. And I then thought that, I needed to get advanced degrees so that I could have this time to like get a liberal arts education. And that's why I stayed at Berkeley so long, because it's like I took history classes, I took PhD courses, I just literally kind of crammed, and it was kind of my like Renaissance period, which happened, later after my undergraduate.
That's a great description. So you being in DC, Philadelphia, and then also at least visiting New York, it sounded like that was after you finished your landscape architecture degree at North Carolina and before you went back to school at Berkeley.
Yeah.
Gotcha. And then for folks that are listening, the HBCU is it's historically Black community university. Something. What's the acronym?
It's a historically Black HB college or university. Yeah, HBCUs. Okay.
College or okay. Yeah, I knew it was something around that vicinity. I wasn't sure what. So you kind of consciously understood what you wanted to learn more of and what you were lacking in quote skill set. So you go back to Berkeley to study architecture and then more of the arts. On the architecture side of the education, how did that compare to studying landscape architecture? Was it more conceptual? Was it, I don't know, how did it compare?
It was, can I compare the two? The landscape program, even the graduate program, when I started at Berkeley, I started in the landscape and then transferred to architecture, I think. Yeah. Because when I first got there, I got a job, actually, my first semester TAing for the dean at the time in one of his early architecture classes, because he had contacted me. He was like, you have experience. So for my first semester at Berkeley, I was literally TAing first year architecture. And then I got a job with Garrett Ekbo, who's like the father of modernism. And he was probably in his late 60s, early 70s at the time. And he ended up, giving me a job. And so in that first year, I was going to his studio up in the hills of Berkeley. And, he was this pretty amazing designer who had this amazing career. He started EDAW, Ekbo, Dean, Austin, and Williams, which literally later would become ACOM. But, he was like this first kind of landscape architect, with Dan Kiley and others who was at Harvard, I want to say in the 20s and 30s, that kind of broke away from the Beaux-Arts and literally had landscape architecture, bringing them into modernism. And so he was very influential in the beginning, because I would go to his studio and do drawings for him, and he would just talk the whole time. And every time I would leave, he would give me a book to read. And I remember he gave me When the Cathedrals Were White, which was a first edition Corp. I just remember this book. I was like, and I read it like in a day. And I was like, wow. And so it became this time in my life where I was literally just, I don't know, taking everything. And by the second year, I saw that landscape architecture wasn't giving me what I needed again. And so I saw there were two architects from France who were ahead of me, and they had gone into architecture. They had finished landscape, but they then got another degree in architecture. And these ended up being Christophe Giraud, who's very, well known in Paris and in landscape architecture and academia. He's still in Paris. And then Dorothée Imbert, who is now the dean at Ohio State. And they were in front of me, and I was like, wow, I like what those guys are doing. So I literally just emulated what they were doing, moved into architecture. And the thing that I found was architecture was just more rigorous in the precision of making, and also more interested in the more speculative ideas in design, where landscape, particularly at Berkeley, was highly steeped in the sciences, whether social sciences or natural sciences. And so there was this very strange subjectivity really didn't exist in this kind of realm in landscape architecture as it did in architecture. And at Berkeley at the time, there was Lars Larup, there was Dan Solomon, Mark Tribe, Stanley Sadowitz was just starting. So there was this collection of people who only thing in common they had were they were interested in design, but they all approached it in a different way. I think Mark Mack was there as well. And so I just loved it that every studio you took, it was someone very different who was just coming at it from a different point of view. And that was like just probably the best time of my life at that time. So I studied under Mark Tribe, Dan Solomon. Lars Nernst was a really big influence through a lot of his kind of writing and his pushback on behaviorism, and really, talking a lot about using, French postmodern theory. And particularly, I got really influenced by the idea of object theory and, how objects actually could be possessed, and all of that kind of conceptual thinking.
It sounds like during that time you were really like the definition of a sponge.
Definitely, because it's all new, and you guys are you've been to the East Coast, but to come to the West Coast from the East Coast, having spent your life there, it was also this place where, I didn't have to dress in all black. I mean, people didn't care. It wasn't that kind of traditional, thing where, you go to the GSD or whatever. It was like everybody's the same. But Berkeley, I remember I was wearing, my first year teaching, I was wearing Air Jordans. And I remember going to Harvard and I had on my black and white Air Jordans, and everybody thought I was a student, but it was just that was my bringing my California back east.
That's funny. That's an interesting observation between the two sides. I think that was definitely the case, and probably more the case at that time, for sure. Things have been kind of equalized in a certain manner. I don't know. I like how you described, your time at Berkeley in that era, because it sounds, first of all, like a lot of fun, and it feels like also you were there learning just because you wanted to do that, perhaps, rather than feeling like you had to for the sake of some kind of predetermined career trajectory, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I tell my students even that today. I don't know. My early part of my career was I tried everything, right? I mean, it was like, I didn't say, this is what I want to do. My students are so like, I want to do this. And I'm like, how do you know you want to do that? And so, right. Like I said, I remember in Philadelphia, I left this landscape firm that I had been with for like 3.5 years or so. And I just immediately just started working in an architecture firm. And, and it was, my friends was like, well, why would you leave this office that's all landscape? I was like, I got bored, and so I go to this architecture firm, and they were doing like, housing, a main line. They were working on sports complexes in New Jersey, but it was just very different. And then, so I just tried just different things. And even when I got to Berkeley, I think my first year I worked for Roma over in San Francisco. I would go there 2 days a week, and I was still like, doing the research assistantship. I remember one summer I worked at the redevelopment agency in San Jose. This is as San Jose was literally beginning to like blow up. This is late 80s. And so I had all of these kind of varied experiences that by the time I really got into school, I was like, that can wait, right? I mean, that's always going to be there. And I knew that diversity in the profession would always be there.
And there's another component to this diversity, which is the arts and sculpture background, which we need to talk about. But I wanted to ask, it seems like you found a way very successfully to, in practice and in the professional setting, still have not only a diversity of interests, but have those different interests weave together and come together for projects, which is, again, sort of like I was saying with regarding your physical space that you're in, is kind of like what I feel like a lot of young designers, architects, landscape architects want to do, but for whatever reason, it doesn't quite happen that way as often.
Yeah, I mean, again, it hasn't been. It's been more accretive. It's like over time, it's like certain things have happened because I just made decisions at certain times. It was definitely by no reason. If you had asked me, 15 years ago, would I be living in a space like this? I probably would say no. But I made different decisions at points in my career. And again, beginning in the 90s, it was just very different. There were certain things that I looked in the profession. There were certain things you did if you wanted to sort of be successful, right? It was like, okay, to get tenure, you have to be the best at what you do. So how do you do that? And I was like, okay, I have to be in magazines. I have to give lectures. I have to do this. And so for 5 years, it was like, this is what you do. And I mean, I must have lectured so much in that 5-year period of time. I had no built work, but it was just a way that you had to do it. And then the next goal was, everybody was like, okay, you got to win the Rome Prize. That was like this carrot. And I was like, I remember applying for the Rome Prize while I was a graduate student. And Mark Tribe, I remember him coming up to me and was like, I saw your application. He goes, you know nothing about Rome. Because of course I did it, and I had made up something. And I remember I had a teaching gig at Harvard in like mid-90s. And while I was there, I had a teaching assistant, a research assistant, who then did research for me on Rome. And literally while I was there, I was writing my proposal for Rome. And then the next year I applied and ended up getting the Rome Prize. And so there were these like things that, that I saw in front of me, which I was just emulating other people in the profession who I looked at who had a level of success. And then when I came back from Rome, it was like, okay, now I have this. So now I can start thinking about my firm and how I wanted to practice, because during the time I was in Rome, I didn't think about architecture. I just painted the whole year. And during that time, I was around scholars, and it helped me when I came back really formulate how I wanted to practice. I knew history was really important. I knew the kinds of work that I was wanting to do. And then I was like, okay, this is the next step in my career. And in a way, it was kind of rational. And then as I was developing this practice that was kind of interrogating history and all of this, I then met Mary Jane Jacobs from the Art Institute. And, I had been teaching at that time maybe a decade, and she asked me to come and be part of an exhibition in Charleston for the art festival. And I did that. And then afterwards, she was like, you should come to the Art Institute and get an MFA. And I was like, and I'm thinking, I'm a tenured professor, and I'm like, why not? And so literally while I was teaching at Berkeley, for 3 years, I traveled the weekends to go and get my MFA at Chicago. And I ended up teaching in the summers, Helsinki, the Bauhaus in Weimar. And it was just this other experience that I was having. And, my office was still pretty small. So I was balancing all of these things at the same time. But it really helped because it put me again in a different cultural setting that allowed me to shape the work. And my thesis allowed me to look at the last 10 years of my practice and really interrogate the practice to a point where I could then think about what the next stage in my practice would be. And that's where this idea of a cultural practice really emerged, doing that study and that work. And that literally allowed me to, again, get to another place, another stage in my career.
That is so fascinating. And when you say thesis, you mean your thesis whilst at the Art Institute in Chicago?
Yeah.
That is so interesting. First of all, your life sounds crazy.
Do you ever sleep?
I don't know if you asked if you ever slept when you were back at school. Yeah.
Good. I'm glad. It's very impressive.
It's so cool because, again, kind of like we were talking about a second ago, I think the clear tendency, maybe more so these days, is for people to want to choose a path earlier and earlier on in their quote careers, and then feel like, as you said, to be successful, you have to stay true to this one lane. And you've, branched out to different lanes at different moments in time. But the fact that that thesis became, it was not just a thing of interest, but actually was productive in a way to kind of critique or analyze and understand your practice is, I'm just really fascinated by it, because it's hard when you have a practice, as we do. You get stuck in this kind of tunnel vision sometimes.
Well, what's interesting too is that it seems like you're thinking about your life and your career as in a way, as a project, right? That's like you're constantly working on and evolving and pushing further rather than, maybe hitting the first milestone and being satisfied with it and not do anything more, which is very interesting.
Yeah, again, I think I'm lucky to have been at the kind of threshold of, I don't know, the kind of generative practices, because literally starting in the 90s, it was on the backside of the kind of postmodern movement where, a lot of people from RIM to, all of those people who are like really here now. I remember the times when they were just making paper architecture, Zaha, right? I mean, they didn't have projects. And so they literally use design research as a way to figure out what the practice was going to be. And then when that first commission happened, then they knew, right, what to make and how to make it. And they just furthered those things. And I think that's what a lot of young designers don't see today, is that those trajectories took years of kind of building these foundations. And from the New York 5 all the way up, you had this culture which I think has been kind of abandoned to a certain degree, right? It's like, I need to win PS1 and then I blow up, right? Or I need to do this and then I blow up, versus saying, I need to figure out how I want to practice. So therefore there's going to be a period of cultivation in some way that helps me, so that when I do get the project, there's a kind of clarity to the work, versus I'm just making the work, and the work, I say it's this and therefore it's that.
Right. Yeah. It's interesting. And this is perhaps a separate conversation, but I sometimes wonder if what you're describing is the result of the pace that seems to be more the norm because of technology and social media and things being shared, that everyone's feeling like they have to keep up this pace and output cool looking stuff or whatever the specifics are, and not feel like they have the time to just kind of look inward. And just look inward and just think about what you're really wanting to do.
Well, I think what you're getting at is like, I can remember information used to be, how can I say, up on the mountaintop, right? Right. Information was like, you had to figure out how to get it. And, sometimes, I remember like in the 96, 97, going to Harvard and going into the library and just being like, I'm at Harvard's library. I'm going to find something here that no one else has ever found, right? I mean, was that kind of thing. I think I had read a novel somewhere about this person getting her PhD, is at Harvard in a library, and she finds this map, and the map takes her some, so I'm thinking in that way. Yeah. And then I'm in Rome with these scholars who are, going to the Vatican to see firsthand stuff, manuscripts that they're then decoding. And then, so to me, that was a way. So even as I was going through tenure, this kind of digging for information, and now the information is like right here, right, with this thing. And it just feels, it's so easy, right, to grab some information and to say, this is it. And I think that's where we are socially, which is kind of scary, because even in design, and there's these few places where there is these kinds of, I wouldn't say agree on, but this nucleus that we all kind of evolve around. I think it's like literally these satellites now, and there's no place where there's this kind of place where we can have conversations about things. I'm blown away in architecture. There's no conversations around housing, which is one of the biggest issues that we have. But I can remember, looking back in history where there was these moments where everyone wanted to figure out housing. Right? For the world, not just for your neighborhood. It was like, we can save the world.
Yeah, and housing is definitely something that should be at the forefront of conversation. I mean, I don't know about other places, but I know obviously in California, there's a need, and it's challenging because that also gets into of course, it's not just the architecture, but how it's funded, where it's located, and all of this kind of stuff, which has to be resolved. I was wondering, so when you're in Chicago and you're doing your thesis, or actually, no, my first question was, when did you start your practice?
92.
Was it like a soft start?
I would say between like 1991 and 95. I think my first project that I finished was probably in 1997, and it was a very small little project, and it was being built while I was actually in Rome. But it took about a decade just to get a project, right? I mean, and at the end of the 90s and 2000, I think we got the De Young in 2000. It was after the millennium getting the De Young, yeah. Or maybe it was 99, 2000, somewhere in there. But the De Young project was kind of the thing that, how can I say, validated that I had a practice, even though I really didn't have a practice when we were doing the De Young. It was still 2 to 3 people. But I have to, commend Jacques and Pierre, because they were very, how can I say, very open in saying, we like, the kind of nimbleness of your practice. You haven't really done a lot, this project will be just really good for you. And, I remember going to Basel and seeing their studio, and literally during that whole project, I learned so much about how I wanted to practice that I literally grabbed a lot of ideas from their practice, because I love that, they thought about material. They didn't draw an image of the work, right? They just made models and talked about the material. They never did a rendering of the building, which blew my mind.
Really?
They never did a rendering, which for the client was like, I ended up doing watercolors literally, of the landscape, and the building was always in the back, but they never did a rendering. And they only did a series of elevations that, had this kind of chiaroscuro facade, thinking about the forest coming out, but they never did a rendering. And it's long enough now, it's been 20 years, so I can say it, like one of the trustees was like at a meeting, I remember, he was like, I run a company and I know you can do a perspective. I know you can show it. I just remember that Herzog was like, no, we don't know what it's like. We don't know what it is. and I love that. And everything then was done in mock-ups. And that was the first time that, I was like, wow. So they bought a warehouse in South San Francisco and they mocked up the galleries. And I was like, wow. So we ended up mocking up our paving, really thinking that all of these things that you should be able to do in design. And it just really gave me a lot of courage, right, to present the work in a way that, how can I say, in practice a lot, and particularly now, when you're giving presentations to a client, you have to, or at least a lot of people start out by trying to convince the client that this is the right thing to do, right? So you start with all of this kind of analysis and precedent, right? And to me, it's not inspiring anyway. And so I like to work through this idea, right? You start with the ideas, and you have to get people excited by the idea. And to have to prove an idea before you present the idea seems to me antiquated as a way of working. And so I'm attracted to those firms where ideas are like the place to begin.
Yeah. That's another really, really interesting and good point. And I also see where in the professional setting, let's say with client meetings, or even how you work in an office, you end up allowing like sort of external goals that you think you need to meet, or things you need to do, dictate your design thinking and process. And it can actually be really, really harmful.
Oh, yeah.
Because you end up going down the wrong path, or just wasting a lot of time, frankly.
Yeah, and that's the other thing about art, though, coming out of an art practice. It's really about the ability to like put yourself in a space where conceptually you're unfettered in the beginning, because you want to figure out, you want the broadest way of seeing, right, the work that you're going to do versus the narrowest way.
And now, a little break for our show sponsors. I used to start remodeling projects with hours of tedious measuring and recreating the existing conditions. And then I discovered Canvas, which is an iPad app and iPhone app that lets me easily scan entire homes in minutes and automatically generates editable models in format like SketchUp, ArchiCAD, Vectorworks, Revit, and more in as little as 1 day. Get to the design phase faster with Canvas. Visit canvas.io/SSP to schedule your demo and to get your first as-built free. Managing design projects and specifications can be challenging, but Programma makes it effortless. Trusted by top interior design firms in over 75 countries, it's the world's most elegant software for interior designers. With its suite of powerful tools, you will experience smoother client interactions with less back and forth, saving you hours of admin work and making your job more enjoyable. Stop struggling and start thriving with the seriously powerful Programma. Click the link in our show notes and get 25% off an annual subscription with code SECONDSTUDIO at checkout. You will wonder how you ever worked without it.
Were there other things that you learned whilst at the Art Institute that, well, I don't know how to phrase this, I guess more in the art kind of side of the education that became influential to your work, aside from, analyzing the office and the thesis, but I don't know, like skill sets or something else?
Yeah, I mean, I think the idea of, just the notion of making a decision, right? It helped me make a decision and then see what you get. Right. And I remember I was doing an exhibition for Project Row House, and I had an idea and I made the work, and then I took the work there and I installed it. And we were part of a larger group with other architects. And I remember of the day of the opening, everybody else is working on their project. At the last minute, people are screwing things in. The opening is happening in 15 minutes. My work was done the day before. And that was the first time I understood the difference, right? I mean, in I don't know, for me in architecture and landscape architecture, we're constantly fiddling to the last minute, right? Making a piece of art is you make a decision and you do it, and it's revelatory. Like I had a painting show last year, and I worked on these 10 paintings, and I remember it's the first time I've ever done a painting show, but I remember that the guy was coming to pick the paintings up, right, on Monday, and it's Friday. My paint needs to dry, right, and I had to stop, and I just had to stop. And I know you guys, you made buildings. You go in there, and it's like we got the checklist, and we're going through. You got to fix this, and we're still like 5 years later going back and trying to fix things. It's like once the work goes, it's done. So there's a beauty to that, and it's really hard to get that to happen in the studio because everybody's constantly trying to get it right, and it's like that idea of getting it right, I think, is a little bit too much.
Do you think that comes from the fact that architecture or landscape architecture is it's in some way like a commissioned work, like it is to be received by someone else, therefore you're always seeking approval, appreciation, providing your best, versus maybe an artist is a bit less worried about those things?
No, I think in art you're worried about it. I think there is I don't know about you guys, it's like I hate going back to my projects in landscape or design. Right?
I hate it too.
Because I want to fix them. I want to fix something, right? But I noticed that if I make a drawing or a painting, I can still see the deficiencies there, but I don't have that same feel like, give me my painting back because I'm not really done. And I don't know what that is. Right. And maybe it's because one is a kind of an object and the other is environment, right? And there's a big difference, I think, when you think of environment, because I don't know, there might be this other layer where you think of care or you think of longevity and those kinds of things. But I'm getting better at letting those things go. Because in landscape, what's kind of nice is the change is just built in, right? And I had to get over the change not only in the maturity of, the flora, the medium continues, but I also had to get comfortable with the human relationships, meaning maintenance, right? I mean, because some places socially and culturally are, maintenance is built in. right? Like if we did the NVIDIA campus, right? They're going to like, that's built in because it's this kind of thing. But a public park, like the DeYoung, the gardens are part of Park and Rec. And so there's like 2 gardeners that does the whole, thing for them. And so there's a level of care that I have to sort of be willing to expect for those kinds of work. And when you so when you're designing, some of that stuff is built in, but there's also a beauty, I think, in the kind of messiness that happens in landscape, right? And somehow in architecture, it happens as well in architecture. If you're from certain places where, buildings are made of renewable material, you have a way of understanding, right, that this thing has a life and that you have to sort of be part of that life.
Yeah, that's another really, really interesting point. And that's one of it is true, a fundamental difference generally between landscape architecture and landscape architects and architects is that landscape architects, first of all, in my experience, tend to be really cool people who are just less stressed out about stuff.
It's more happier.
They're being happier. Maybe I think it's the time they spend outside with nature.
It's a vitamin D,
Well, that's also a misnomer. I spend no time outside in nature. I think that's the projection. Everybody thinks I love nature. It's like I have this relationship with the world. I mean, with these ecologies. But I did all my hiking and stuff very early. It's like put me in a nice hotel any day.
But you're right, though. It's with the landscape architecture, it kind of forces you. It tends to be that there's a certain amount of understanding of the longer life and sort of letting go. And as you were speaking, I was thinking about for me with architecture, one of the things that reminds me of the lesson you just described, which is not being overly perfectionist. That's kind of one way to summarize it, is when I go see historic, important pieces of modern architecture by Frank Lloyd Wright, Corbusier, or whoever, and a lot of times they're not perfect. Not just, I don't mean just in terms of construction detailing and techniques, because construction science has evolved, but even their execution, there's like weird corners and stuff. Yeah. And when I'm in the spaces, for me, it's very clear. It's like, well, what makes this house or this building successful? Is it because every corner is perfect? No, it has nothing to do with that. So for me in my own work, a lot of times I'm like, it's not that I'm being disregarding, it's not like I'm being irresponsible, but there is a point of creating something where you have to let it go, and it's not going to, and then move on to the next one, and let it be what it wants to be, sort of.
Yeah, but when you go to those spaces, though, at least for me, if you have an understanding of the ideas that they're working with, there's a beauty. Like every time I go to a Wright house is like the hearth. Okay, I get it. Compression. I mean, and you're moving around the houses in a very particular way. I mean, you're always coming back to that thing. And whether it's a Corbusian, I just remember Frampton's compaction compression. Every time I go into a Corbu space, that, he's putting, these things, the ramp, the stair, all of these things in a box, and you're experiencing them. And so that's the thing that I miss in architecture and design, the conversations around just these ideas. And that's what I was getting at with housing. It's like, we should be thinking about how people should be living today, right? It's not, we need more social housing, we need more of this, but we should just be thinking about, okay, we're in a new place now. How should we be living? And I think you don't see us going, well, maybe we should be living more collectively. Maybe we should be living in smaller things more individually. I mean, but just ways in which one might think of living in this world that's constantly changing. And to me, those are the ideas that, for me, even in landscape, I'm less interested in form now. I'm more interested in like patch, like how can I create, this thing that people can go into versus something that people look at, right? And that's been this evolution for me as well, that, very early in my career was all about form, right? What looks cool. And then now it's like there's so much swing, all of this stuff that has no meaning. And to me, getting back to those very simple things, like I was talking to my students the other day, was the difference between a 4-square grid and a 9-square grid. And they look at me like I'm crazy. And I'm like, a 9-square grid has a center, Just these dumb little simple things. And it's almost like we're not teaching that anymore as ways to begin, just these very simple logics of how we exist in space. And we're kind of like defaulting that we have to live in this Cartesian world, right? And so I just think that to me is more interesting than the visual quality of something these days.
Is housing, has it been or is it going to be a project of yours, either in real life or as a case study theoretical project, do you think?
I don't know. I mean, because I started my career working with a lot of architects doing social housing here in the East Bay. Those were some of my first projects in my studio. And I had to stop doing them because I had no impact on them. I thought I could have impact just through planting, right? And of course I couldn't. It was the form, the site planning, those kinds of things that literally dictate. And now, a couple people in my studio wanted to work on a few housing projects. So we have a few in the studio right now. But, the urban party of social housing now is like, put everything on top of a podium. I'm like, why? This is senior housing. Why do we have parking for senior housing? Or why do you put seniors on a thoroughfare? Why don't we put seniors in a landscape, right? Versus, it's just that it's the same formula over and over and over, and it's just not interesting. And then you go to places like Denmark or Germany, and you go like, wow, look at these typologies. That people are thinking about in VRDV. I mean, some of their typologies that they're thinking about with housing just blows my mind. I could say, why are we not thinking in these terms? But in the back of my mind, I would love to do it, but it's kind of like it would be research more than anything, unless there is this larger movement, I think collectively where, it's like we really take it serious, how we want to live. I mean, we're doing tough sheds here for people to live in. And I'm like, well, I remember Stephen Hull did a book that was profoundly influential to me, was vernacular housing types. He starts with the 1/1, the mother, Father, Son, Holy Ghost. I lived in Philadelphia. Buildings are like 18 feet wide, stacked. You got the shotgun house. You got the double shotgun. I mean, you got all of these typologies to draw on. And here we are putting people in maintenance sheds, right? I mean, it's just, and you don't see the AIA or anyone like going, hold a minute. There are worker cottages all over the East Bay, where people were living in 400 square feet. I mean, a bungalow is only 800 square feet. And these things are selling for $2 million. And so again, it's this kind of amnesia to a certain degree.
I think it's you're correct. I think the economics also come into play quite clearly. I mean, things are, like you said, $2 million for 800 square foot, whatever it was. And bungalow, actually, it also reminded me too, bungalow, even on the profession side for professionals practicing and teaching, it's not. Speaking from a first-person perspective, it's not easy. It's almost not even practical to teach part-time, support yourself that way, then have a practice. 99% of the people, friends, colleagues I know who do that, they don't really have a practice, and they probably never will, because it's just, there's not enough. The time and money balance is not there.
Yeah. I mean, I'm like, I don't have a family. I can't imagine if I had a family, right? My life would be completely different. And, I made certain choices that, my career was the main thing that I've been focusing on. And, I put a lot of time into it, and it takes a lot of your time and energy, right? I mean, and then even economically, I'm only dealing with myself and my family, my nephews and my nieces and my sister. But, it's not that I have, this concubine here that I have to deal with. And I see it with my colleagues, and I see it, here in the Bay Area. And, I live, like I said earlier, I live in like 150 square feet for like 2 years. I could do that, but I couldn't imagine putting a group of people through that.
Yeah, maybe 250, just an extra 100 square feet would make, actually that would have been double the size.
Right.
One of the things I was also wondering is, something you just said about So your practice is the landscape architecture, design, and then also art. Had you ever thought about becoming an architecture studio also by, I don't know, I guess hiring architects as part of your staff and saying, okay, now we can technically do full buildings of whatever scale and we can just do it?
No, I've thought about it. And, right now I have we have 4 trained architects on staff right now. And I've always hired architects because the work has never been, again, a kind of, singular. It's always been hybrid. So, we have small structures and things like that. But I've never really wanted to because, how can I say, it takes so much, right? I mean, so much. I think it takes a lot of infrastructure, I think, to make buildings, I think. And I don't have that much time. And I would rather put the time into the art practice because the art practice gives me a broader, how can I say, a broader range of things that I can do and a broader or more diverse communities that I deal with and those ideas that I can work with. And it kind of helps bridge that gap to me. And I always come back to Rosalind Cross's diagram of sculpture in the expanded field. And that's where I've kind of wanted to kind of find that place where it's not architecture and not landscape, but it's somewhere in between. But it's calling on those two things, right? And in her diagram, I love that, the construction part of landscape is that sculptural aspect, right? If you go to a landscape site and it's being graded, it's a beautiful sculpture until they fine grade it, and then it's not anymore, right? Everything gets resolved. Or, axiomatic structures, in architecture, taking architecture and art, you will look at an artist making a structure. They might use the same material. They might use 2x2s for everything. So it's non-hierarchical. And so an architect looks at it and goes, that's not structural, right? And it's that place that I love, right? That kind of in between, because slowly I'm learning that once you start making certain decisions, you lose the material. And I always think about sidewalks. If you go to a site and sidewalk is being laid out, you'll see the 4 inches of concrete, right? Because they pour it, they remove the forms. They then backfill the dirt so the 4 inches go away. But if you left the 4 inches, that concrete would be this beautiful ribbon in the landscape, right? And so that to me is the sculptural aspect, right? And even in architecture, if you go to a building being framed, you're like, holy crap, that's beautiful. Look at the light coming through, right? And then you put the sheathing on and it goes away, right? And so
oh no.
Right, that in between is like where I just love it, because that's that place where you're beginning to discover just different things.
I gotcha. Yeah.
I was wondering how big is your studio? How many people are on your team?
I think we're like maybe 17, 18 now. Yeah.
That's big.
Wow,
It's gotten big, and I have a partner now. I'm bringing on more partners. Yeah. So I'm trying to find a balance where I'm really more focused on the art stuff right now, which is really part of all the projects though. So it's not like, this is just art here, but in most of our projects, there are these more sculptural components or more, how can I say, elements in a project that we want to fabricate and we want to be responsible for. So we've really met some really great fabricators who are helping, so in every project, there's something very idiosyncratic that we can't give to a contractor, right? That we pull out. And so we have enough practice now that our clients are comfortable enough, right, to say that aspect can be pulled out and you guys can do that.
Yeah, that's really cool.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Is there a dream project or place that you would love to design that you haven't had the opportunity to? I'm sure there is a bunch, but is there one that, I don't know, you've been wishing for?
Oh, I would love to do the Serpentine. But that's that's out there in the ether. But the Serpentine to me is like this wonderful thing because it's temporary, but it has the ability to be in another place that I'm not that familiar with. And I love London, but it's one of those places. It's like my dream projects are going to other places and actually having relationships and something manifesting, right? Those are really great times because you also have this kind of cultural, right, shift or relationships where you're actually learning something new. And I think I mentioned it early. It's really nice to put yourself again in a different cultural context so that one can grow and one can become in a different way than staying in the same place, right?
Yeah.
And because you don't really become, right? You stay the same to a certain degree.
Is it hard to convey some of the things you're describing today to people in your office? And I don't mean that as like a criticism of like employees in your office, but what I mean to say is you have a fairly unique like perspective and also unique set of experiences, which has all been informed, each other. And it, I think, produces fantastic results. But it also occurs to me that might be a difficult thing to, if you're a one-person shop, then that solves the question I'm kind of getting to. But if you have a studio of 17 and you're working with other people and you teach and all this stuff, like how do you teach this? I guess is one way to kind of phrase it.
No, it's difficult because, what you're talking about is culture. Again, this kind of cultural setting. And, we just moved into a new building space. I bought a building 2 years ago. We've been in it now coming on a year. And that was just part of the discussion we were having because in the old studio, it was really about me, right? And you could tell. You came in there and it was my studio. And so now we're in this space where it's collective. And one of the young architects, I gave her the agency, to go ahead and design it, and she's one of the students I had at Yale. She's from California, and so she's in the office. And so that's been great, right? Working with her and getting the building and just trying to build this culture. And, they teach. I welcome them to come and teach at Berkeley because I really think teaching is part of that. So one of my partner, Alma Dussolier, she teaches, in the first year. And so again, that teaching is just really important. The others, they come over to the university. And so just trying to build that aspect. And then in the studio, I still, do things a certain way. I still do watercolors. I still make models and things like that and trying to kind of bring that in. But there is definitely a shift where, how can I say, I'm really idea-based and really irrational in a good way about how to approach work, right? I want to approach every project differently. And, people are taught you do the same thing over and over, right? To a certain degree, and really trying to break that. And we have a different model now where, I have at least 3 principals on a project versus, and one's a kind of a backup, but there's always 2 people in constant exchange on a project versus a singular person, because it's forcing us now to have a dialogue across. And that's becoming very fruitful as far as just getting the partnership people at the top to be clear so that the people coming up have an understanding of how we work. But that's a dynamic that we're constantly trying to deal with.
Yeah, and I was also wondering if, given the level of sensitivity that you have, to your own work and the work, if there are definitely studios where the solution to this part of the conversation is that the person at the top is the auteur and everyone just falls in line, and they're kind of like interns or something like that. Yeah. And the other model, I suppose, on the opposite end would be like, okay, I am David. I have my few projects that I'm leading, and they're done in my manner. Yeah. And you, a person I've hired, we're not the same person, but I trust you enough we're in the same direction. But it's yours, and you use your emotions, your own subjectivity, and you run it. Yeah. And those are extreme ends in terms of how an office can be run. But I suppose that latter could be a solution, but it would be a lot of people who own offices are not okay with being that loose and hands off with it.
No, it's taken me a while, that I look at certain projects and I definitely am not in the project. But I'm hoping that the culture, right, is there, right? That's helping the person running the project. And one of the things that I think connects our projects is this idea of narrative, of story. And right, there's always a kind of a consideration for that place. And that's one of the cultural layers, that there's a research component to the work, right? That we're constantly, digging and trying to talk about, whether it's past, present, and future. But I do think at a certain level, I have to be comfortable, right, with the partners or the principals that are out representing Hood Design Studio, because I understand that the clients are looking at the body of work and there's an expectation of that work. And that's the way I like to think about it. And so, the one thing that has helped, I've tried to articulate that in every project, there's something that's idiosyncratic, right? And it's coming out of that research. And so, projects can be broad in their programmatic identity, but, I've never tried to reproduce the same project over and over and over. And so when you look at the work, it's kind of like, I always get this from people. It's like, oh, now I understand what you do. And I'm like, no, you don't, because the next project is coming, right? And so it's this idea that, as long as there can be that difference, I just get so, I don't want to duplicate the same thing over and over because it doesn't reinforce the ethic.
Do you find that artists are more able to think as freely as you do compared to the traditionally trained architect or landscape architect generally?
Yes and no. I mean, someone in my office was like, Walter, if you have this thing that you're doing sculpturally and you just do it over and over, we can make more money at this. Look at blah, blah, blah. And so, some artists have a thing that they do, right? I mean, Terrell makes sky spaces and he's really good at making sky spaces, right? So in a way, again, I think the practice goes, it's just different, because I do think I'm hoping, I think I live a hybrid life. I have this hybridity, right? Where sometimes, I can become like this, but most of the time it's a lot of things. Whether I'm painting, whether it's I'm, making models, whether I'm making a landscape or making a small sprite. I mean, all of these things are kind of influencing one another. I'm hoping to a certain degree.
Yeah. And you probably have a fair amount of freedom, because if you have an idea or set of ideas or research, you can begin to test it, express it through any of the things you just mentioned.
Yeah, and that's that to me is the beauty. Like I tell my students, it's like if you're interested in something and you show me a drawing, that you're not interested in it, right? I mean, it's like, because they're always going like, yeah, I was interested in this. I was like, okay, how were you interested? And then they show me one drawing, and I was like, that's not interest. If you're interested in something, show me all of the stuff that you made, 10 models, you read 10 books, that interest created something, right? That allowed you to move in a certain way. But I just think they're all pejorative words that people go, I was thinking about this. I'm interested in this. And I'm always like, so how were you thinking? And then there's nothing, right? There's nothing that manifests. And to me, that curiosity is the thing that should motivate making. And so those limited concepts or those kind of conceptual floods of hybridity, but you have to find some way, right, to be in it and have an interest in it. So
I'm re-energized after this recording. I have to go back to my desk.
I'm glad.
My task today is to finish designing some things, which I was struggling with, but now I'm like, I'm going to get to it.
Thank you, Walter, for re-energizing David. Much appreciated.
It's funny.
I might give you a call once a week just to re-energize him.
I have a presentation in a half hour with a client who has seen nothing. And I'm like, okay, maybe I'm energizing myself up for this meeting.
I know we're coming up the hour, but there's a final question we always like to ask, and actually I'll make it two in this case, is what is your favorite building and what is your favorite space? Space, I'm thinking landscape architecture, I suppose, but space.
Wow. Well, my favorite building would have to be the Pantheon. Yeah, that's my favorite building. Every time I walk in the Pantheon, it's like I'm like in awe. Always. I mean, it's just, I don't know what it is about the building. I mean, it has this presence, and every time I go back to Rome and I go in and I see people, they immediately are looking up or looking down, and that's just a beautiful thing. My favorite landscape. I would say my favorite landscape is being in the woods. Right? Being in this kind of enmeshed experience where everything goes away, right? And it's just me and these things and the ground, I mean, that to me is, and it's not about, being in nature or contemplative. It's about being in a space where you're just part of it. And I don't know any other way to explain it. And this might go back to your first question. When I was growing up in Charlotte, there were a lot of vague terrains. J.B. Jackson uses this term, which was these leftover pieces of space. Like there was a telephone right-of-way behind a house with these aerial things, which was this big right-of-way. But people left spaces in their yards, and it just overgrew. And I just remember we spent a lot of times in these spaces, and they were just overgrown spaces. And there's something missing. We don't have those that much anymore. And they kind of, maybe it's a romanticism for that, but when I go into spaces like that, they're very nostalgic and very powerful. And it's probably because we don't have a lot of them, right, in our lives anymore.
That's a beautiful description of a space and a way of thinking. Walter, thank you so much for making time on a Friday late morning, just before a client presentation.
Yes.
Gold star for sure. We super appreciate it. We could keep the conversation going, and hopefully we'll do. And thanks again.
No, thank you guys. This was very pleasant. And I really appreciate taking time with me this morning.
Thank you, everybody, for listening to this week's episode. If you like what we're doing, then please support the show by leaving a review of it in the Apple Podcast app. You can also find the show on Spotify and YouTube. The show's on Instagram. The Office fame is on Instagram and also on YouTube. And we have a website for both The Office and the podcast. The podcast is secondstudiopod.com, which is the same thing as the Instagram handle. We have about 90-something thousand people on there, I think. So you should follow us and help us get to a higher number, and also contribute to the community, engage in conversation, debate, agree, disagree, but be nice. That's number one rule. Be nice.
Yeah,
right?
Be positive, people.
Oh, I don't care about that. Just be nice.
Okay. We also have the hotline. Did you mention that?
No.
213-222-6950. There is any good guest suggestions, topics, any things you want us to talk about. If you have any experience you want to share, feel free to reach out.
Yes, and I hold in my hand a piece of paper, printed a question from a guest that typed out their question and texted it to that hotline, and it will be read and discussed on the next recording. But I leave out names, and people often say, don't mention my name, don't mention the school. Of course not. I would never do that.
Unless you want to.
Unless you want to. Unless you want to name a professor anonymously and say, this professor sucks, then you let me know.
But we need evidence.
Oh, evidence?
Well, yeah, we don't want to destroy
true,
people's lives unless it's...
All right, everybody. Thanks again for listening. A lot of really cool guests coming up.
Okay, talk soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.